Hello all, today I'll be doing a more detailed account of the meditations, namely meditation 2, and then later I'll record my lecture on meditation 3. The first thing that I recommend though is that you've already read this material and that you've also read the Blackburn. So if you've read those things, this should make a little bit more sense. Otherwise it's probably going to be a little bit too detailed and step by step. You'll get lost in the trees, confusing trees for the forest. But with that in mind, I'll also try to provide some overarching considerations, some take-home points that you can draw from this lesson and know where to focus your attention for sort of studying purpose and that sort of thing. And another note is that I changed to OneNote here, so I'm trying out and seeing if OneNote's a little bit better. I can draw in OneNote for one thing, and it's easier to copy and paste images if I ever deem it appropriate, so we'll see. But overall it'll be the same old boring method of a standard college lecture. So in meditation 2, Descartes is now trying to rebuild from the smoldering ruins of knowledge that have been completely demolished. So if you recall in meditation 1, he uses the method of hyperbolic doubt, radical skepticism, Cartesian skepticism, and tears down everything we thought we knew. He attacks the senses with two main arguments, the part of prudence argument and the dream argument, and then he attacks reason and the senses with the evil demon argument. So now everything is doubtable. We might worry that nothing that we thought we knew is correct. So now the task, starting in meditation 2, is to build up from the ground level. So the most memorable features of meditation 2 are 1, the cogito, and 2, the wax argument. So if there's any two central points to take home, is to understand the cogito and the wax argument, and we'll talk about them a little bit more as we move along. But first, I'm just going section by section here, so these little sections correspond to the paragraph number that are numbered in the document that's linked in the resources tab that you're hopefully using to read this text. It's useful to read it in the online form because it has these paragraphs, so you know precisely where I'm referring to page by page. If you don't prefer reading online, you could always copy and paste and print it out or get a PDF or something of it. So just to know where these things refer to, right? They're the section headings of that Oregon State text that I offer. That's the URL. It's some Oregon State professor posted it initially. But anyway, so in section 1, there's just basically a review, the sort of things that I've already emphasized, that where are we at now? What do we know? Well, we don't really know anything. We're in the state of radical doubt. And so from the state of radical doubt, Descartes is wondering where we can go, what we can claim to know, and he eventually meanders to the central point that, and this is the cogito, I am, I exist, right? And so this is in section 3. So you'll also hear this phrase as I think, therefore I am. A better version is I think, therefore I am a thinking thing. So this argument is pretty self-contained. Just the simple fact that there's thoughts going on shows that at the very least there's something thinking. And so it doesn't matter whether or not the evil demon is deceiving you about every single thing, whether it be, that the sky is blue or that 2 + 2 = 4. The fact that he can even deceive you suggests that there's something to be deceived, and that thing is a thinking subject. So you can know that feature of yourself, of your cognition, that you have a mind and that it's a thinking sort of thing, regardless of whether you know anything about what the physical world is like, including your body. So this is why Descartes titles the second meditation of the nature of the mind that is more easily known than that of the body. So the reason why it's titled that is, of course, because the first thing you can ever know is that you're thinking. If you're just reflective, you'll realize this fact, and that's how you even know about bodies. And so we'll get to that second point about how it's actually, in fact, a matter of thought that leads us to knowledge about bodies. And that'll come up in the wax argument, the second main thing that we'll cover. But first, I'll elaborate a little bit on this cogito. So it's called the cogito. I guess this might be confusing because it's just the Latin cogito ergo sum. So like cogitating, if you're familiar with that word. So like it's like mentation, thinking, thought. Cognition maybe is the closest. So yeah, so there's cognition, ergo, therefore, I am is the idea. I've said that. This has two potential claims you can draw out of it. So you might think that the reason that I know that I exist is because I think, right? So this is an epistemic claim. It's a claim about what we can know. And then there's also a metaphysical claim. If something doubts, in order for it to be able to doubt, it's a thing that must exist. So both of these sorts of things seem to be implications. But of course, I guess this is the primary focus, the epistemic one. But he also is interested in some of these metaphysical claims. So, yeah. So, he does want to reiterate, though, that the fact that I exist at all doesn't entail much else, right? So like, are you a VT student? From the position of radical skepticism, from Cartesian doubt, you don't have access to this fact, right? You can't reliably say, yes, I know this to be true, because of course that depends on a whole series of memories and experiential history that's inadmissible. So you don't know your gender, your age, any of those other sorts of basic facts about yourself. All you know is that you're a thinking subject. And of course, this is where Blackburn comes in with the elusive I idea that I've already discussed in another lecture, so I won't reiterate it too much here. But it does seem to be an open question as to what is this I that exists if we don't have any knowledge of anything about us. It doesn't seem like there's any self above and beyond the cluster of experiences that we have. And if we're deprived of that cluster of experiences, there might be nothing there. So it may be the case that all we can legitimately say is there is thinking occurring rather than I am thinking. So section 5 isn't very important. He just talks about what he thought he knew. But of course, this is an illegitimate assumption as a result of the evil demon. And then this sort of thought that he can't know anything about his body, but he can still know some simple facts about his mind. Most importantly, that he's a thinking thing. That's the most defining characteristic of having a mind, right? That it's something that has cognition, consciousness. This suggests that there's a difference between these sorts of things. If you can know about one without knowing about the other, they're different kinds of things, might be the idea. So this is an argument for mind-body dualism. This is also an important one. It might be worth adding here. Except for OneNote doesn't have as good a formatting. Whatever. So the argument for dualism is something like thinking is inseparable from me, bodily occurrences are separable from me, so the body is inessential and the mind is essential. So an additional premise here you might want to add is a suppressed premise, as I like to call them, is if something is conceptually inseparable, it is essential, right? So if you think of a triangle, you're gonna think of a three-sided figure. If you're not thinking of a three-sided figure, you're not thinking of a triangle. So when you think of a mind, you must be thinking of something that has cognition, right? And when you think of yourself and what you are, thinking is inseparable from that fact. The very fact that you're thinking about yourself suggests that, right? But the body, you can think about yourself in abstract, and maybe the body isn't so essential. You can conceive of yourself without a body, it might be said. So, because there's this difference, Descartes thinks that the body is inessential and the mind is essential, and thus they're of fundamentally different kinds. So dualism is the position are of distinct kinds. So they're radically different sorts of things. So you couldn't ever get enough physical things, like, as in body we mean just material stuff in general. So for Descartes, you couldn't get enough physical stuff in the right arrangement to ever make a mind. A mind is something above and beyond and separate from any arrangement. Whereas maybe in the modern worldview, scientific view, you might think, well, if we got a fancy enough computer and we arranged it in all the right ways, you can get a mind out of that somehow. Descartes would reject that and say that these things are fundamentally different. So the worry here with this argument is just that it seems like this, Blackburn calls this the Masked Man Fallacy, but another way to think about this problem is that it seems like Descartes is relying too heavily on what he knows as a mark of what is real, right? So he thinks that the fact that he can conceive of something in a certain way and not conceive of something else is suggestive of the way the universe actually is. So he's using his limited knowledge, his epistemic state, as it were, to say something profound about metaphysics. But it might simply be the case that he is epistemically confused, that his principles are incorrect or unjustified or something like that. So this might hold weight, might not hold weight. Another worry that you might have is that this sort of principle that thinking is inseparable from me is based on a sort of conceptual claim, right? That it's internally coherent, just like a square has four sides. Thinking is part of what it is to be a thinking thing. But you might think that the evil demon can confuse us about even these very, very simple facts. So Descartes himself says something like, I could, every time I add 2 plus 3, get the wrong answer, right? An evil demon could be strong enough to do that. So it seems like an evil demon could be powerful enough to also make us believe something incorrect about how thinking is separable or inseparable from us. So just a potential worry you could elaborate on or think about if you're interested. But the important thing is just to understand this argument. Well, I guess it's just this argument. This is a different way of putting it. I cannot conceive of myself considering a thinking. Without considering a thinking thing. I'm sorry about that. I cannot conceive of myself without considering a thinking thing. What it is to think of oneself is to think of a thing that thinks. I know that's a funny sentence, but I can conceive of myself without a body. That is, you could think of yourself in the abstract and just about the sort of mentations you have about the world. So these things seem to be of different sorts and of different importance in terms of defining who we are. That's a general idea. Okay, so here he just is wondering a little bit more about what it is to be him, and he just reiterates, this is kind of redundant. He says it's a thinking thing, and a thinking thing is the sort of thing, going on to 8, that has mentations, and there's a wide range of mentations that you can have. So he talks about how you can have emotions, feelings, perceptions, beliefs. These are all facets of being a thinking thing. And you can't deny that these things are happening because they're so obviously happening. The thing you can deny is that they're true or accurate or justified or something like that. So the fact that you feel loathing towards Descartes' convoluted arguments, that may be an unjustified belief and it may be perfectly clear, but you can't deny that you're at least having that thought hypothetically. So, and the same thing goes with any sort of other perception or something, right? Like if I perceive a unicorn, there's nothing faulty going on there until I say it's a fact about the universe that there really are unicorns. That's when you make one step too far. And so this, and also reviewing slightly, an important point that is again a sort of reiteration, so it's not essential, is that of course Descartes is opposed to the notion that we're just an assemblage of parts, that we're merely bodies, and of course we can know about ourselves without knowing about anything about bodies, so they're clearly different things. So the argument goes. And here in 9, Descartes gets a little bit more into the notion that perceiving is a form of thinking. And so the reason why this is important is because this is the initial, so we're getting out of the pit of skepticism, right? So Descartes has first established that you can know yourself. Not only can you know yourself, you know what kind of thing you are, and you know that this kind of thing is distinct from other sorts of things like bodies, right? Minds are not the same as bodies, so we already know something about the world. And then now he's going into making sense of perception. So he's building back up from the foundations. So according to Descartes, perception is also a form of thinking, right? Representations or visual experience is a simpler way of saying that, are presented to the mind's eye, and this isn't just a passive faculty of sensing things. Our minds actively organize the world around us in a specific sort of way. So we'll get into that a little bit more in a second. So this is why Descartes says that we can only rightly perceive external objects if we clearly and distinctly perceive them. And so this clear and distinct principle will be something that I cover later, but it's just the idea that a clear and distinct perception is a perception that is self-evident. So I wonder if I could just click. No, I can't just click in there. So it's self-evident. So just like when you think of yourself, you have to be thinking about a thinking thing. Self-evident. When you think of a triangle, you have to be thinking of a three-sided figure. These sorts of things are self-evident truths, so they're clear and distinct. It seems like there's something logically necessary. So if there's something logically necessary about the way we perceive external objects, then they're clear and distinct, and therefore they're justified. And that's at least the idea that underpins this. Right. So the first case of this is that, so in terms of further justifying claims to what we can know about the world, is that of other bodies. So first he's established what a mind is, and that minds are distinct from bodies, and now Descartes is interested in establishing what are bodies and how do we know that they're real things in the world, right? So this is one step further out of the pit of skepticism. And this is famously the wax argument. So you've read this example and you're familiar with it, so you can take this ball of wax and you put it and you look at it, and it's a certain color and a certain texture, certain hardness. It makes a certain sound when you flick it. Certain smell, did I say? It probably has a certain taste if you were to taste the wax. And you put it next to the fire, and through time, all of these properties change, right? It doesn't smell the same. It loses its color. It becomes soft. It no longer makes a sort of knocking noise when you hit it. And so then the question is, how do we know this? So one way that I organize this argument is you might think of it as what is called a transcendental argument. So a transcendental argument, you don't need to know that. This is just kind of something extra you can pick up. Is an argument in which there's some fact that needs explaining, and you explain all the necessary conditions for that fact to arise. And so these necessary conditions are also things that must be the case, right? So you can pick out extra things about the world by showing what has to be the case for this fact that we know to be true to be the case also. So that might be a little bit complicated, and if it is, don't worry about it. If you're interested, ask me or look it up. Transcendental Argument. So the idea is that there's this basic fact that we know that the same piece of wax is the same over time, right? And that seems kind of interesting. Like in a certain way, it seems really obvious. Like, of course we know it's the same piece of wax. But then you might ask, how is this possible that we know that the same objects endure through time, even if they get changed in all of their surface perception and all the ways that we superficially perceive? So Descartes kind of does a process of elimination. So there's a few different ways that we could know this fact to be the case. And this is, namely, we either know by reason, imagination, or the senses. And then he does a process of elimination to come to the fact that it must be reason. So he first eliminates the senses by saying it's clearly not the senses alone, because otherwise, well, because all of the properties change, right? All the sensible properties change, and we still know it's the same thing. So the senses aren't underpinning it. Otherwise, yeah, it's just not the case, right? Because all the properties change. Right, like the purple turns clear, and the honey smell turns to no smell in particular, and the hardness turns soft, and the like cylindrical shape of it turns to mush or an oval shape. So I think that's clear enough. It's not the imagination either, because we can't, of course, predict all the formations or the actual formation that the piece of wax ends up taking. So it's not a product of the imagination. So what's left? It must be reason. So even our knowledge of physical things in the world, physical sensible things, is a product of reason. And so it would be crazy to say that it's only reason and that we could just know about physical things in an armchair alone. But the only way that we can know certainly with clear, distinct perceptions is if we know through reason. So the senses provide us with a certain sort of raw material that of all this changing, flashing of experience from moment to moment, and the active faculty of our minds organize this stuff in a certain sort of way and that's just reason at work. So what are some things that we know about the wax? Well, we don't know all of these like temporary things like the taste of it or the smell of it or the specific shape of it at any given moment. Those things we don't know because, of course, they're like fleeting and they're not clear and distinct exactly. They're not self-evident just from the concept of wax. You can't draw out the conclusion that it's purple or that it smells a certain way. But something that is self-evident, that is logically, conceptually entailed in any idea of an object or in the idea of wax, is that wax is a thing extended in space, it's potentially flexible, and that it can move, right? That it moves within space. Wax isn't everything and just occupies all of space. So these are things we can know. So now we have a few different things we can know. And so I'll just briefly sum those up before I move on to the last little portion here. So we know about I exist, right? You know about yourself. You know that the mind is different than the body. And you know that you know how bodies are known. So we're getting out of this pit of skepticism, and of course all of this is done by reason, right? So this is this sort of rationalistic method. He just employs this idea of clear and distinct ideas to work through what's conceptually entailed in these different things, like the fact that I'm conscious, or the fact that I know about my mind but I don't necessarily know about my body, or the fact that we have an idea of bodies at all, what's entailed in each one of these. And that's how we can know anything. I'm sorry if that was too low. You might not be able to see that at the very bottom. And so if there's any confusion about conceptually entailed, I'll just briefly say that again. So when I say this sort of clear and distinct ideas are self-evident, C&D equals self-evident equals conceptually entailed, or something roughly like that. So one example of that is when I ask you, what is a bachelor, right? You tell me it's an unmarried man. A bachelor is an unmarried man. I don't need to write that down because you all know that. And that's not some new information that I'm telling you. That's just built into the structure of the very idea. So same thing, built into the structure of our knowledge of any body is going to be the fact that it's something that's in space. That's just what it is to be a body or an object or something material. And it's going to be movable within space. It's not occupying all of space. So by just thinking about what these concepts entail, we can know some things for sure about them, or at least that's the thought. Okay, so that was just mega review. And now we'll just finish up the very last portion here. So these last thoughts are just a little bit of warning. So a potential objection that someone might have is that ordinary language says that, oh, we know that wax is the same wax because we just see it, right? And that's something that we kind of commonsensically say, but Descartes says, don't take this ordinary language, it can be deceiving, and that's not a good way to base our metaphysics. So an example of how ordinary language can mislead us is take the cases of the statements LSU beat Auburn, nobody beats Auburn. So if you read these side by side and assume that the nouns are operating in the same way, you'll think in both cases that this the antecedent sort of part is referring to another sports team. If you knew nothing about sports, you'd say, oh, this team won out against this team, right? And then in this case, you might do the same thing because these sentences seem to be of the very same structure. It also seems like nobody beat Auburn again, right? But of course we know, upon a little bit of reflection, that these sentences are operating in pretty different ways. So the lesson here is not to think that nobody refers to something. It doesn't refer to anything. That's precisely what it does. But it looks like on the surface grammar of it seems to suggest that it's operating in the same way as LSU is. And so that's just a lesson in why ordinary language can be misleading, and we might need to do a closer analysis and not trust it. So following in the spirit of Descartes and doing more conceptual analysis as opposed to just relying on our commonsensical uses of terms, just to make sense of what he's saying there. So last but not least, he just sort of summarizes. He says that even bodies are known by reason, and if I can know about bodies, I must first be able to know that I can think at all, so that this sort of last thought justifies the initial claim, the subtitle of the entire thing, that the mind can be more easily known than the body. So I hope that was a helpful review. I tried to lay out things as clear as I could and give you the main points. If you have any questions, of course, always ask. And I will post meditation 3 shortly. Alright, bye bye.